This is my true story. I worked my whole life so my son could live in comfort. I thought when I grew old, he would give me love and respect in return. But one night, he looked me in the eye and said, "The bed is for people, not for dogs like you. Sleep on the floor." He laughed with his wife while I lay on the cold ground, humiliated in my own home. My heart broke, but I was not powerless. I stood up, and you won't believe what I did next. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. All my life was built on sacrifice for my son. I was not born rich. I worked with hands that blistered, with a back that bent under heavy loads, with sweat that soaked my clothes and tears I never let anyone see. Every coin I earned was stretched, not for me, but for him. When he was small, I carried him on my shoulders, even when my own legs trembled. I walked miles to save bus fare just so I could buy him milk. I went hungry so he would never feel the sting of an empty stomach. My body aged faster than it should have because I worked more than a man should, but I never regretted it. Every day, I told myself it was worth it, because my son would grow strong and never know the pain of poverty that I had known. When he grew older, I gave more. I paid for his education, every book, every uniform, every fee. I wanted him to have the chances I never had. When he failed, I picked him up. When he succeeded, I clapped the loudest, even if no one else was watching. When he wanted a car, I saved until I bought him one, though my own shoes had holes in them. When debts came and crushed him, I bailed him out. When marriage came, I paid for the wedding, smiling even though my pockets were empty. I even gave him a home. The house he lives in, the very walls that sheltered him, came from me. My hands laid the foundation. My money kept the roof above his head. I never kept anything for myself. I lived simple, ate little, wore old clothes, while he enjoyed comfort, safety, and wealth. Every time I looked at him, I told myself, this is my reward. This is why I worked so hard. This is my legacy. I believed that when I grew old, when my body grew weak and my steps slowed, he would remember. I believed that he would sit by me, respect me, and care for me as I cared for him. That was the dream that kept me alive through years of labor. But dreams do not always meet reality. My sacrifices, which I thought were seeds of love, grew into weeds of arrogance in him. He began to see comfort not as a gift, but as his right. He began to see my giving not as love, but as weakness. He believed the wealth, the home, the comfort were his by default. And when respect should have been my return, cruelty was what I received. Still, I held on to the thought that my sacrifices would one day remind him of who I was. I thought deep down he would remember the father who carried him, fed him, clothed him, lifted him. But I was wrong. Sacrifice without gratitude becomes a chain. I gave him everything, and in the end, it was those gifts that he used to lower me to the ground, to treat me like less than human. The cruelty did not come in one sudden moment. It began slowly, almost quietly, creeping into the corners of daily life until it became normal. At first, it was the way my son spoke to me. His tone changed. He no longer called me with respect. Instead of father, I became old man. Instead of speaking with patience, he spoke with irritation, as if every word I said was a waste of his time. I told myself not to take it to heart. I convinced myself he was stressed, that life's pressures had hardened him, that deep down he was still my boy. But the small cracks became deep wounds. When I walked slowly, he mocked me. "Move faster," he would snap, as if age was a crime. When my hands shook and I dropped a cup, he laughed and said I was useless. At meals, he stopped asking if I had enough to eat. He piled food on his own plate, and if there was little left, he gave me the scraps. His wife followed his example. Where once she smiled at me kindly, now she looked at me with disdain, as if I were nothing but extra weight in her house. The house I had built with sweat became a place where I felt smaller every day. My chair at the table, once a place of honor, became a corner where no one noticed me. If I spoke, they ignored me. If I asked for help, they sighed as though it was too much. Slowly, I became invisible in my own home. The respect I had earned over a lifetime disappeared as if it had never existed. My son began giving me orders instead of requests. Do this. Clean that. Sit there. His voice carried no warmth, only command. I obeyed quietly, swallowing my pride, telling myself it was better than starting arguments. I thought maybe if I stayed silent, things would get better. But silence does not stop cruelty. It only feeds it. There were moments when I saw the boy he used to be, flashes of kindness that reminded me of the son I once carried on my shoulders. But they faded quickly, buried under arrogance. I would tell him stories of my past sacrifices, the nights I worked double shifts, the meals I skipped, the debts I paid for him, but he would roll his eyes, saying he didn't want to hear old stories. My sacrifices, the very reason he had a comfortable life, meant nothing to him. The commands grew sharper, the insults grew louder. I became less of a father and more of a servant, and still, I endured. I told myself, he is my son. He will remember. He will change. But deep down, I felt something shifting. The boy I raised was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as nothing more than a shadow, an old body taking up space. These were the first signs of cruelty. I ignored them, hoping love would return. But love without respect turns into poison. And soon, the poison would strike me in a way I never imagined, on the cold floor of the house I had built. The night of the cruel act is burned into my memory. It began like any other evening. I sat quietly at the edge of the room, my body tired, my mind heavy, while my son and his wife laughed at the table. I listened in silence, hoping for a kind word, a sign that maybe they still saw me as family. But instead, I heard only arrogance. When I asked softly if I could go to bed early, his laughter stopped. He turned toward me, his eyes cold, his mouth twisted into a sneer. Then he pointed to the floor, right there in the living room. His words struck me like a hammer. The bed is for people, not for dogs like you. Sleep there. At first I thought he was joking. A cruel joke, yes, but a joke. But when I looked at his face, I saw no smile, only seriousness. His wife giggled, covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes filled with mockery. My heart sank, my legs trembled. I waited for him to take it back, to laugh and say he was only teasing. But the moment never came. Instead, he walked to my room, closed the door, and claimed the bed for himself while leaving me standing in the middle of the floor. The room felt colder than ice. My pride screamed inside me, but my body was weak. I had no strength to fight, no voice to argue. Slowly, I lowered myself to the ground. The floor was hard, unkind, pressing into my bones with every shift of my body. The cold crept into my skin, into my chest, into my soul. Above me, the ceiling stretched into darkness, but I could not close my eyes. Shame kept them open. I remembered the nights when I carried that boy, my boy, to his bed. When he was sick, I laid him down gently, tucking the blanket under his chin so he would never know discomfort. When he had nightmares, I held his hand until he drifted back to sleep. When he was tired from playing, I lifted him onto the bed with arms that ached but never complained. And now, years later, that same boy stood above me and called me a dog, forcing me onto the ground where no human should be. Every breath I took that night was heavy with pain. My body ached from the hardness of the floor, but worse was the weight in my chest. My son had not only taken away my comfort, he had taken away my dignity. His wife's laughter echoed in my head like cruel music. The house I built, the roof I paid for, the bed I bought, all of it was turned against me. I lay there for hours, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my thoughts burning. I realized then that this was not just disrespect, this was erasure. He was erasing me, lowering me, stripping me of the last fragments of honor I had left. And as the night dragged on, a fire began to burn inside me. The cruel act did not only humiliate me, it woke me up. That night on the floor, I made a silent promise. If he saw me as a dog, then I would remind him that I was still the man who gave him life, who built his world, who held the keys to everything he thought he owned. He thought he had broken me, but he had only broken the last chain, holding me in silence. That night, lying on the cold floor, I felt a pain deeper than my body could carry. The hard ground pressed into my back, my shoulders, my hips, and every bone seemed to protest with every movement. But the ache in my body was nothing compared to the ache in my heart. I stared up at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes. The words my son had spoken. "The bed is for people, not for dogs like you," repeated in my mind again and again like a curse. I could hear his wife's laughter, sharp and cruel, cutting into me like a knife. I turned my face to the side, and my eyes landed on the bed. The very bed I bought with the money I earned after years of sacrifice. On that bed, my son and his wife slept soundly, their breathing steady, their bodies wrapped in warmth and comfort. And here I was, his father, the man who raised him, the man who gave him everything, forced onto the floor like some forgotten animal. The humiliation burned inside me. It was not just about sleeping on the ground. It was about being denied the dignity of being human. I remembered every moment of my sacrifice, nights when I skipped meals so he could eat a full plate, days when I worked double shifts, my hands blistered, my back broken, all so he could wear new clothes and go to good schools. I remembered the first time I held him in my arms, so small, so fragile, and how I promised myself I would never let him suffer the way I did as a child. I gave him my everything, my strength, my money, my youth. And now, the boy I once carried in my arms had forced me onto the floor, laughing while I lay broken and humiliated. Tears filled my eyes, but I held them back. I did not want to give him that power. I lay there silently, listening to the sound of the house I built. Every wall, every corner, every piece of furniture was paid for with my sweat and blood. And yet, inside that house, I was nothing more than a shadow, a servant, a burden. The silence of the night was heavy, broken only by my own thoughts. The humiliation was so deep that it cut into my soul. But even in my pain, I thought of the past. I thought of when he was a child, running through the house barefoot, his laughter filling the rooms. I thought of the nights I sat by his side when he was sick, holding his hand, whispering to him that everything would be okay. I thought of the times I gave him my last coin, never letting him see the hunger in my eyes. All those memories, all those sacrifices, and this was my reward, the floor. The worst part was not the pain in my body, it was the realization that my son no longer saw me as a father. He saw me as a burden, as less than human, as someone unworthy of respect. That truth was heavier than any weight I had carried in my lifetime. Yet as I lay there, silent in my humiliation, something began to shift inside me. At first it was only a whisper, a quiet thought buried beneath the pain. But slowly, it grew stronger. I realized that while he saw me as powerless, I was not powerless at all. My silence was not weakness, it was patience. My stillness was not surrender. It was the calm before a storm. The humiliation he gave me that night would not be the end of my story. It would be the turning point. I promised myself that this would be the last time I ever lay on the floor in his house. This would be the last night he laughed while I suffered. He thought he had reduced me to nothing, but he had forgotten who I was, the man who built his world, the man who still held the keys to his future. I closed my eyes finally, not in defeat, but in quiet resolve. The humiliation had cut me deeply, yes, but it had also carved out the strength I needed to rise again. He had made me sleep on the floor like a dog. But one day soon, he would learn that the man on the floor was still the master of everything he thought he owned. My son thought that by forcing me onto the floor, he had stripped me of everything. He believed that humiliation had broken me, that laughter had buried me, that his cruelty had made me powerless. But what he forgot was that power does not always live in loud voices or strong bodies. Power also lives in silence, in patience, in the papers that hold names and signatures, in the laws that protect the hands that built. As I lay on that floor, he may have seen only an old man with no strength. But in truth, I was still the keeper of everything he thought was his. The house he slept in so proudly, that house still bore my name on the deed. Every wall he claimed as his, Every door he slammed in my face, every room where he mocked me. They were all legally mine. The money in the bank, the accounts he thought would one day be his, still sat under my control. The cars he drove, the land he bragged about, the inheritance he boasted to his friends about, none of it belonged to him yet. The truth was simple. He lived under my roof, on my land, with my wealth. Without me, he was nothing more than a man standing on borrowed ground. He had forgotten the power of blood. He had forgotten the power of a father's hand, not the hand that fed him food or wiped his tears, but the hand that signed documents, that signed wills, that held the keys to every lock in his future. My humiliation on the floor was real, yes, my pain was real. But none of that erased the truth that I still controlled the legacy he thought he owned. I remembered how proud he was when showing off the house to guests. He would walk them through the rooms, pointing to the furniture, the design, the size. He would say with pride, "This is my home." They clapped, they nodded, they admired. But what none of them knew was that it was not his home at all. It was mine. His pride was built on a foundation that was not his. And with one decision, one stroke of a pen, I could take it all away. He laughed at me that night, calling me a dog. But he did not know that the dog still held the chain. He thought he had reduced me to nothing, but he had reduced himself to blindness. For while he mocked my silence was my weapon. He thought I had no voice, but my voice was not in shouting. It was in authority, in the quiet power of ownership. Even the food he spit on and called his, that food came from money I gave. Even the bed he denied me, that bed was bought with my sacrifice. Even the roof above his head, that roof was nailed in place because of my work. His cruelty came from arrogance, but arrogance without foundation is only an illusion. As I lay there, I realized something powerful. Humiliation does not erase truth. He could strip me of comfort. He could strip me of kindness. But he could never strip me of the control I still held. That truth gave me strength. That truth gave me fire. That truth turned my humiliation into resolve. I knew then that he had made the greatest mistake of his life. He thought I was powerless because he looked only at the surface, at my weak body, my trembling hands, my silence. But beneath the surface, I still held the greatest power of all, the power to decide his future. The inheritance he dreamed of, the wealth he relied on, the property he claimed as his. All of it was in my hands, and I would no longer keep it there for him. That night, I stopped being afraid. I stopped being small. I stopped being the man on the floor, because I remembered who I was, the builder, the provider, the owner, the father. He had forgotten, but I had not. And soon he would remember too, when the walls he called his would no longer belong to him. That night on the floor, after hours of staring into the dark, I finally made my decision. My heart had carried enough pain, my body had endured enough humiliation, and my soul had swallowed enough silence. I could no longer pretend that things would get better, that my son would suddenly remember the love I once poured into him, that he would one day treat me with dignity. The slap of his words, the spit of his laughter, the cruelty of forcing me to sleep on the ground, these were not accidents. These were choices he made, and now I had to make my choice too. At first I asked myself, should I forgive? Should I keep enduring? Should I keep staying in this house where I was no longer seen as a father, but treated as less than human? But the answer came quickly, as sharp as the pain in my chest. No. Forgiveness cannot survive where there is no respect. Patience cannot grow where there is only cruelty. Love cannot live where it is poisoned every day by humiliation. The decision was clear. I would not forgive. I would not endure. I would not stay. I decided I would stand up, not just from the floor, but from the chains he had placed on me. I would stand up for my dignity, for my worth, for the man I had always been before age bent my back and slowed my steps. He wanted me to believe I was powerless, but that was his mistake. The power was still in my hands, the same hands that once built his life. And with those hands, I would take it all back. I would not scream. I would not fight. I would not lower myself to his level. My revenge would not be in anger, because anger fades. My revenge would be in decision, because decisions last forever. And my decision was simple. I would walk away with everything he thought belonged to him. I would take the roof from above his head, the comfort from beneath his feet, the security from his future. I would leave him not with riches, but with emptiness. Not with pride, but with shame. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The bank accounts still bore my name. The properties still listed me as owner. The inheritance, the deeds, the future, all of it was written with my signature. He had mocked me as powerless, but he had forgotten who held the pen. I would use that pen, not as a tool of forgiveness, but as a weapon of justice. I would rewrite the story he thought was his. As I lay on the cold floor, the decision gave me warmth. It was the first time in years that I felt a fire inside me again. My humiliation had become my strength. My silence had become my weapon. My pain had become my resolve. The man he forced to sleep on the ground would rise, not just from the floor, but above him. And he would never see it coming. That was the night I decided. I would no longer be the old man on the floor. I would be the father who erased his son's arrogance. I would be the man who took back what was his. I would be the hand that turned humiliation into justice. The morning after that night on the floor, I did not wake up as the same man. I woke up with resolve in my chest. My son thought I was still the broken old man he left on the ground, but inside me, something had changed forever. I rose slowly, my bones stiff, but my heart stronger than it had been in years. I gathered my few things, my documents, my identification, and the folder where I kept copies of all the property papers, the deeds, the bank account records. These were not just pieces of paper. They were my weapons. They were the keys to everything he believed belonged to him. I walked past him in silence that morning. He barely noticed me, sitting at the table with his wife, eating breakfast bought with my money, drinking coffee made in the kitchen I had once built. He did not even look at me. To him, I had become invisible, but that invisibility was my shield. He had no idea that I was on my way to erase his future. He had no idea that the man he mocked as powerless was about to take everything back. I went straight to my lawyer, a man who had known me for decades, who had handled my affairs with care and respect. When I walked into his office, he saw the look in my eyes and asked no questions. He simply listened. I told him everything. The humiliation, the cruelty, the night on the floor. My voice did not shake. For the first time in a long time, I spoke not as a victim, but as a man reclaiming his dignity. And then I gave him my decision. I wanted every document changed, every will rewritten, every account secured, my son's name erased from everything. My lawyer nodded. He prepared the papers quickly, his hands moving with precision, his eyes watching me with quiet respect. One by one, he placed the documents before me. One by one, I signed them. Each signature was more than ink on paper. Each stroke of my pen was a strike of justice. With every signature, I felt the chains fall away from me. The house, no longer his future. The land, no longer his claim. The money, no longer his right. The inheritance, no longer his promise. I cut him out completely. I also gave instructions to transfer everything into accounts he could not touch. I secured assets so tightly that no court, no trick, no plea could return them to him. I left nothing loose, no loophole, no escape. My son had thought he owned the world I built, but he would soon discover that he owned nothing. I made sure the law stood with me. I made sure justice was written in ink. When the work was done, my lawyer leaned back and said quietly, "It is finished." I sat there in silence, breathing deeply. It felt as if a great weight had been lifted from me. For years I had carried the shame of his cruelty, the burden of his disrespect, the humiliation of his laughter. But now, with a few signatures, I had turned all of that into strength. I had turned humiliation into revenge. I had turned silence into power. I walked out of the office with lighter steps than I had in years. The sun felt warmer, the air clearer, the world freer. I was no longer the man who lay on the floor. I was the man who had risen and taken everything back. My son had wanted me to be nothing. But now, I was everything again, not in his eyes, but in my own. And that was enough. The execution was done. The revenge was sealed. And soon he would learn that the floor he forced me to sleep on had become the ground beneath his own fall. The days that followed were quiet for me, but not for my son. He did not know it yet, but the world he thought was his was already gone. I watched him carry himself with the same arrogance, walking around the house, giving orders, laughing loudly as if nothing could ever touch him. He spoke about future plans, about the land he would expand, about the money he would use for investments, about the inheritance he believed was guaranteed. He bragged in front of neighbors, boasting that his father was old and finished, and that everything was already his. I listened in silence, knowing the truth that would soon strike him harder than any blow he had ever given me. It started small. One morning he went to the bank to withdraw money. He came back angry, his voice sharp, his face red. He shouted at his wife about some mistake in the account, saying he could not access the funds. He thought it was a problem with the bank. But I knew better. The accounts were mine now, locked tight, untouchable by his hands. The first crack had appeared. Then came the house. He spoke proudly to his wife about making changes, maybe taking a loan using the house as security. But when he went to the office to make arrangements, he discovered the truth. The deed no longer had his name attached anywhere. The property, the land, the very roof above his head. All of it had been secured under my control, shifted legally so he had no claim. He came back furious, slamming doors, shouting that something was wrong, that this was unfair. He screamed at me, demanding answers, but I said nothing. I simply looked at him, my silence heavier than any words. His arrogance quickly began to collapse. Bills arrived, but he could not pay them. Debts he once ignored began to chase him, and he had no money to answer with. He grew restless, his temper short, his pride wounded. The man who once laughed at me now paced the floors in anger and fear. His wife began to question him, blaming him for their sudden problems. Their laughter, which once rang in the house while I lay on the floor, was gone. Now their voices were filled with tension, blame, and panic. Neighbors started to notice. They saw him shouting in the yard, saw the arguments, heard the anger. Whispers began to spread. The same people who once believed his prideful words now looked at him with pity, even with disgust. They learned quickly that his father had taken back everything, that his arrogance had been built on a lie, that the man who mocked his own blood had been left with nothing. Their respect for him disappeared, replaced by quiet judgment. And me? I felt no fear. I felt no guilt. For the first time in years, I felt justice breathing in the air. Every tear I once swallowed in silence now returned to him as humiliation. Every night I lay awake in pain now became his sleepless nights. Every cruel word he threw at me now echoed back at him from the mouths of others. The humiliation he gave me was returned to him, but not by my hands, by the weight of his own choices. When he finally realized the truth, it was too late. His voice cracked with desperation, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How could you do this?" he shouted at me. But I only looked at him, calm, steady, unshaken. He had never asked how he could treat me as he did, never asked how his cruelty had broken me. And so, I gave him no answer. The silence was my justice. The fallout was complete. The man who once forced me to the floor now stood powerless, stripped of wealth, stripped of pride, stripped of the future he thought was his. He had laughed at me. Now, the world laughed at him. And I did not need to lift a hand. All I needed to do was remember who I was, the father who built, the man who owned, the one who still held the power. The house that once rang with his laughter turned into a place of silence and shame. My son, who had strutted around with pride, now walked with his head lowered. His wife, who once joined him in mocking me, no longer smiled at him. She looked at him with anger, blaming him for the downfall, blaming him for the humiliation that now followed them everywhere they went. Their voices, which once shouted with arrogance, now argued in whispers that even the neighbors could hear through the walls. The life they thought was built on stone was crumbling into dust. Relatives came to know of what happened. They whispered behind his back. Some even laughed quietly when he passed by. The story spread. The son who mocked his father, who spat on his dignity, who forced him to the floor like a dog, had been left with nothing. The people who once believed his lies about being the master of the house now knew the truth. He was no master at all. He was a beggar in waiting. His pride was gone, his respect gone, his comfort gone. All that remained was his shame. I remember watching him one evening from the doorway. He sat at the table, his head in his hands, no laughter in his voice, no pride in his eyes. The same table where he once spit in my plate, the same place where he called me names, had now become his place of silence. His wife scolded him, her words sharp, her tone bitter. He had promised her wealth, a future, a life of ease. Now she saw only the ruin he had created. Their marriage, like his pride, began to fall apart. And me? I was no longer there to suffer. I had already taken back what was mine. I had already walked away with my dignity. I no longer lay on the floor. I slept in a bed of my own, in peace, in quiet, in dignity. The humiliation he gave me no longer haunted me. Instead, it haunted him. The shame he forced on me returned to him like a shadow he could not escape. Neighbors avoided him now. Once they came to his door for parties, for laughter, for friendship. Now they crossed the street to avoid his eyes. Children whispered about him when they played outside. Even strangers knew. This was the man who lost everything because he could not honor his own father. His arrogance was not only destroyed, it was remembered, retold, and marked on his name forever. The aftermath was heavy for him, but light for me. For the first time in many years, I breathed freely. I no longer felt trapped in the house I built. I no longer carried the chains of his cruelty. I no longer swallowed my tears in silence. Instead, I stood tall, even with my old and weak body, because I had reclaimed my worth. I was no longer his victim. I was my own man again. And every night when I closed my eyes, I remembered that floor, that humiliation, that pain, not as a wound, but as a lesson. It taught me that no matter how low someone tries to push you, if you still hold the truth and the power, you can rise again. My son had called me a dog. But in the end, it was he who begged for scraps, and it was I who walked away with everything. The aftermath was not mine to carry, it was his, and he carried it heavily every single day. When I finally walked away from that house, I did not carry bitterness with me. I carried freedom. For years, I had believed that my love for my son would protect me, that my sacrifices would be enough to make him honor me in my old age. But I learned that sometimes blood does not mean loyalty, and family does not always mean love. He made me sleep on the floor like a dog, but I rose from that floor as a man who remembered his worth. And with every step I took away from his house, I felt lighter, stronger, freer. Justice, for me, was not in anger. Justice was in dignity. Justice was in showing him that the man he mocked still had the power to change his life completely. Justice was in reminding him that respect is not given by force, but by choice, and he had chosen cruelty, so I had chosen consequence. I took back the house, the money, the inheritance, everything he thought was his future. I left him with nothing but the shame of his actions. That was my justice. I found peace in a smaller place, a quiet home where no one laughed at me, no one ordered me around, no one treated me as less than human. I bought a bed that was mine alone, and every night when I lay down, I felt the difference. The floor was behind me forever. My tears were behind me forever. In their place was rest, dignity, and the knowledge that I had stood up for myself when it mattered most. The world saw him differently now. Neighbors spoke of his downfall. Relatives told the story again and again, and even strangers knew of the man who lost everything because of his cruelty. His name, once carried with pride, was now whispered with pity and disgrace. He had mocked me, but now he was the one mocked. He had humiliated me, but now humiliation followed him like a shadow. That was justice, not by my hand, but by the truth of his own actions. And me? I no longer looked back. I no longer asked why. I no longer wished for him to change. I accepted the truth. He had chosen his path, and I had chosen mine. My path was dignity, peace, and freedom. His path was shame, loss, and regret. That balance was enough for me. I did not need him to suffer more. I only needed to know that I had not let his cruelty define my final years. I lived quietly, but I lived with respect. I gave my time to people who valued me, people who listened, people who cared. And I found more family and strangers who showed kindness than I ever found in the son who carried my blood. My justice was not only in what I took from him, but in what I gave myself. The right to live the rest of my life with peace. And so, when I think back to that night on the floor, I no longer feel pain. I feel strength. Because that was the night I decided never again. That was the night I stood up in my heart, even before I stood up with my body. That was the night humiliation turned into justice. Final thought, he made me sleep on the floor like a dog. But I stood up, walked away, and left him to beg for the rest of his life.